Greetings, everyone, and welcome to our next lecture in the class, which is going to be about Phoenicians. And I do have some video for this to help break up my horribly recorded voice here, because they were among the first to be trading with all the other Mediterranean cultures at sea. They were the first and only culture for several millennia to actually develop the use of advanced seafaring technology. And when we talk about cultures trading with each other, like people saying, I need cedar wood for my temple or my palace, or I need silver from Spain, or I need tin from England, or anything like that, right? Wine from Macedonia. It all came from the Phoenicians. They were the ones to go get it for you. So the deal is that the Phoenicians were the web that held everybody together for quite a long time. Here's a good image of where the Phoenicians were. Back in their very beginning, that is. There's a couple different cultures here. Down in this region, right about here, there's one group called the Canaanites. And we don't see them on this particular map yet, but they're basically right down here. Then we come up here, and the Phoenicians have taken over this region. And then in here, you've got the Fertile Crescent. So at one point, you've got the tribes of Israel that eventually turns into the actual kingdom of Israel. And then you've got over here, Hittites and Assyrians and Sumerians and Babylonians are all over on that side. The Phoenicians were here very early on. And they set up all these cities. These cities, some of them you might recognize the names of, okay? These cities are Phoenician cities right along the coast. They're going to be some of the first civilized cities to actually have seaports, because of course these guys need to be able to protect themselves while they send their people out to go trade. And on top of that, people really, other kings didn't really mess with the Phoenicians usually. There were a few kings that did from time to time, but most of the time the Phoenicians lived in relative peace because honestly, they controlled trade, which means if you wanted to have a good economy, you had to work with the Phoenicians because they were the only people sailing on the Mediterranean Sea in the open ocean, not just traveling around on small reed boats like the Egyptians were, right? These guys were raising sails and heading out into the ocean on galleys that were carrying trade, huge cargoes of trade, and nobody else had that kind of shipbuilding technology. And the Phoenicians protected their maritime technology very, very carefully. It was a state secret of the entire culture. And I say culture instead of the kingdom because all these cities are separate little city-states. That's a way to say, like what the Greeks had for a long time. They're cities that have their own ruler. Some of them had democracies and some of them had kings. Yes, I said forms of democracy before Athens developed it. The Phoenicians, we have some evidence to show that some of their cities also had forms of democracy. It's just that the Greeks are still around and the Phoenicians are not, which means we don't really give them the credit they probably deserve for developing that idea. In any case, let's move in. I have a short video right here to kind of give you some background. Here we go.
Carthage's rise is intimately linked with the history of the Phoenicians. But just who were the Phoenicians? Well, to start with, they were a cultural group which lived in the coastal areas of the Middle East, a region covered today by Lebanon, northern Israel, and western Syria. Here, these ancient Bronze Age people lived in a series of independent city-states, which included the noble settlements of Tyre, Sidon, and Byblus. By mastering ocean travel and trade, they managed to link together the far-flung markets of the ancient world and grow wealthy from their profits. Their power only grew as economic activity across the Mediterranean accelerated over the course of the 3rd, 2nd, and 1st millennia BCE. However, in the 1200s BCE, the Bronze Age collapse threatened to bring the whole known world crashing down. Yet the Phoenicians would prove resilient. Amazingly, they weathered the storm and even managed to capitalize on an open market while their land-based rivals withered away. As a result, great cities such as Tyre, rose to preeminence. Fueling their growth was a movement to expand on existing trade networks by founding hundreds of outposts and colonies across the Mediterranean. By 800 BCE, there were Phoenician colonies everywhere, from Cyprus and Sicily to Spain and North Africa. In these endeavors, the Phoenicians found fierce competition from their Greek rivals, who were also occupied with colonizing the Mediterranean in places like southern Italy. Such colonies could range in size from small trading posts or religious sites to fully fledged cities. Politically, the Phoenician colonies of the Mediterranean were free to govern themselves, although they typically paid homage to their mother cities in various ways. Economically, however, the Phoenician colonies were increasingly being dominated by Tyre, which had grown wealthy from the east-west trade routes across the Mediterranean. In particular, control of the silver trade coming from Spain made it one of the most formidable cities of its time. Carthage was born out of the flourishing Phoenician trade network. In fact, its founding in modern-day Tunisia strategically positioned the colony to take advantage of both the east-west trade route, which ran from Phoenicia to Spain, and the north-south route, which ran from Africa to Italy. Geographically speaking, the city itself was ideally located at the tip of a peninsula with both natural protection and close access to the sea. The true turning point for Carthage would come with the decline of its mother city. In 586 BCE, Tyre came under siege by the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar II. The siege must have been exhausting for Tyre, as it lasted for 13 years. Ultimately, Tyre was able to beat back the Babylonians, but not without cost.
Okay, hope that helped a little bit. Let's look a little bit about dates. You've heard some of the video already, but here's some dates for you. Around 3000 BCE, so we want to say how many years ago that was roughly. We are 2020 right now, so let's say 2,000 years into AD or Common Era. So that's 2,000 years plus 3,000 years. So that's 5,000 years ago from today, roughly, was the first Phoenician settlement, okay? 5,000 years ago. Now, that's not the first human settlement. The first human settlements like Jericho and other cities like that started up maybe around 11,000 years ago. So these guys are not newcomers to the idea of settling down. Just remember that when we talk about the Phoenicians, and I should mention that the very earliest Egyptians were earlier than this, okay? So when we talk about the Phoenicians setting up cities, okay, they come later. And I might have to ask this, right? This is a good quiz or test question. Why do you think the Phoenicians come after the Mesopotamians and the Egyptians? And the answer would be that these guys don't settle along a river that did all the farming for them when they first showed up, right? These guys don't have a flooding and ebbing river system that's helping things grow naturally. The Phoenicians kind of branch out from cultures that already do that. And they set up cities that don't even need to have farms because the Phoenicians are able to import all the food they want without having to worry about farming. So these guys are trading without farms, meaning these guys are already people that are used to an advanced culture by the time they move to the coastline. So they come later. They're tribal groups that have been influenced by other earlier civilized cultures. Okay, so 3000 BC, 1800, we've got the Egyptians moving in at their heyday when we talked about Amenhotep and all that, right? 1600 BC, we've got trading with foreign cities all throughout the Mediterranean. So this is the beginning of the actual height of Phoenician power. 1400 BC, we've got Hittites moving in and controlling, not taking over or conquering, but controlling, okay? That means tributaries. 1200 BC, and these guys are independent and building colonies throughout the Mediterranean. 800 BC is the beginning of the glory day. The Assyrians are in control. There's more tributes again, but the Phoenicians are still around. Nobody's going to conquer the Phoenicians for a while, okay, because they are so important, okay. 585, we've got Nebuchadnezzar moving in and conquering a good deal of Israel. We'll talk about them later. And he's a Babylonian, by the way, you know, this Neo-Babylonian Empire. Nebuchadnezzar conquers a whole bunch of territory, but only can conquer some of the inland Phoenician territory. He cannot conquer the towns, which are fortified and supplied by sea. And then we have Alexander coming along. That's Alexander the Great, who's going to conquer some Phoenician territory for the first time ever, like the city of Tyre. We've got 64 BC, when the Romans destroy what is left of the Phoenicians by the time we get to here. This is a long legacy of human existence. And a lot of these people, the irony of these guys coming in and conquering and all that, a lot of these guys owe their very existence to the Phoenicians. And we'll talk about that as we get into trade and trading empires and language and culture. Here's an idea of what the Phoenician trading empire and their colonies look like. So when we talk about colonies, we're talking about right here. It's been some time, all right? The Phoenicians started out trading, not as colonizers or conquerors. Once we get to 1200, the Phoenicians start to set up colonies. And that doesn't mean specifically that they're conquering things, nor are the Phoenicians ever ruled by a single emperor or king. They're not like the Ottomans or the Romans. The Phoenicians never do that. They have these separate little territories that are kind of linked together loosely as a confederation of cities or colonies, right? Confederation of colonies, confederation of colonies, confederation of colonies. This is very much the way the Greeks did it, and maybe the Greeks got the idea from them. I have no idea. I'm not going to actually make that claim because I don't know. It's just that we know the Phoenicians were doing what the Greeks would do later first. Okay, that's all I can say. And they were trading with the Greeks, so who knows? So anyway, you have these different Phoenician colonies, like right here. These are two different Phoenician systems under different Phoenician forms of settlement. And although they're Phoenicians and they're traders and they're similar to each other, they're not exactly the same. Okay, let's just keep that in mind. So we kind of got this kind of southern western Phoenicians, and we got the rest of these guys, and there we go. Okay, this is a visual of a type of trading vessel the Phoenicians had, and this gives us a visual of the type of military vessel, much heavier built with a big ram on it, that the Phoenicians had. Okay. Phoenician traders. Let's get to the heyday. We're right around the time of the Assyrians, which I know it sounds like when I go back to this thing here, under the Assyrians. That doesn't mean that the Assyrians conquered the Phoenicians. It means the Assyrians basically called the shots for the Phoenicians for a while until the Assyrians ceased to exist. And so what that means is that the Assyrians were a big empire in Mesopotamia, which means that the Assyrians had a lot of trade and they had a lot of needs. And so they were coming to the Phoenicians for that trade and for their needs. And what that means, people, that's like metals and technologies and lumber and stuff that only the Phoenicians could supply. And what that means is that the Phoenicians, right around the time of the Assyrian Empire, enters their glory era because the Phoenicians had so much trade to do between advancing cultures here and the Assyrians that were just a huge draw of resources from around the Mediterranean. There's a lot you need to run an empire, and the Assyrians needed the Phoenicians to do this for them. So income is generated by all this trade by 900 to 800 to 700, where the Phoenicians become this huge power, and they start to build bigger and better ships, and they start to go further than any other culture in this region has ever gone. So I'm going to tell you here, actually, I'm going to let a video, because what the heck, tell you the story of Hanno, just to give you the idea of how far these guys went and what they were doing. It's pretty awesome. So here you go.
This is the account of Hanno, king of Carthage, about his voyage to the Libyan lands beyond the Pillars of Heracles, which he also set up in the shrine of Kronos. The Carthaginians ordered Hanno to sail out of the Pillars of Heracles and found a number of Libyphoenician cities. he set sail with 65 oared ships, about 30,000 men and women, food and other equipment. After sailing beyond the pillars for 2 days, we founded our first city, called Pho Neatians. Below it was a large plain. Sailing westward from there, we arrived at Sodorius, a Libyan promontory covered with trees. Here we dedicated a temple to Poseidon. Sailing to the east for half a day, we reached a lake. It was not far from the sea and was covered with many long reeds, from which elephants and other wild animals were eating. After our visit to the lake, we sailed on for 1 day. By the sea, we founded cities called Karakon Techos, Gite, Accra, Melita, and Arambis. Continuing our voyage from there, we reached the Lixos, a large river flowing from Libya. The Lixites, a nomadic tribe, were pasturing their cattle beside it. We remained with them for some time and became friends. Beyond them, hostile Ethiopians occupied a land full of wild animals. It was surrounded by the great mountains from which the Lixos flows down. According to the Lixites, strange people dwell among these mountains. Cavemen who run faster than horses. When we had got interpreters from the Lixites, we sailed along the desert shore for 2 days to the south. After sailing eastward for 1 day, we found in the recess of a bay a small island which had a circumference of 5 stades. We left settlers there and called it Kern. We calculated from this journey that this island lay opposite Carthage. For the time sailing from Carthage to the Pillars, and from there to Kern, was the same. Sailing from there, we crossed a river called Churetes and reached a bay which contained 3 islands, bigger than Kern. After a day's sail from here, we arrived at the end of the bay, which was overhung by some very great mountains, crowded with savages clad in animal skin. By throwing stones, they prevented us from disembarking and drove us away. Leaving from there, we arrived at another large, broad river teeming with crocodiles and hippopotamuses. Returning from there, we went back to Kern. From there, we sailed to the south for 12 days. We remained close to the coast, which was entirely inhabited by Ethiopians, who fled from us when we approached. Even to our Lixites, their language was unintelligible. On the last day, we anchored by some big mountains. They were covered with trees, whose wood was aromatic and colourful. Sailing around the mountains for 2 days, we came to an immense expanse of sea, beyond which, on the landward side, was a plain. During the night, we observed big and small fires everywhere, flaming up at intervals. Taking on water there, we continued for 5 days along the coast until we reached a great bay, which, according to our translators, was the Horn of the West. There was a large island in it, and in it a lagoon, which was salt like the sea, and on it another island. Here we disembarked. In daytime we could see nothing but the forest, but during the night we noticed many fires alight and heard the sounds of flutes, the beatings of cymbals and tom-toms, and the shouts of a multitude. We grew afraid, and our diviners advised us to leave this island. Quickly and in fear we sailed away from that place. Sailing on for 4 days, we saw the coast by night, full of flames. In the middle was a big flame, taller than the others and apparently rising to the stars. By day, this turned out to be a very high mountain, which was called Chariot of the Gods. Sailing thence along the torrents of fire, we arrived after 3 days at a bay called Horn of the South. In this gulf was an island, resembling the first, with a lagoon, within which was another island full of savages. Most of them were women with hairy bodies, whom our interpreters called gorillas. Although we chased them, we could not catch any males. They all escaped, being good climbers who defended themselves with stones.
Okay, so there you are, right? A bit about Hanno. He's just one of the Phoenicians that traveled out the way that Hanno did. We have some that speculate that the Phoenicians made it as far as North or South America. I don't know because there's no evidence to prove that. So there's always speculation. We just don't have the evidence for it. So maybe one day, right? We'll find out. So we have cloth that the Phoenicians are trading all over the Mediterranean Sea. The Phoenicians made some cloth, and they also connected other groups that made cloth to trade, right? Dye, purple. Often you hear about the color purple being the color of royalty for ancient cultures. That's partially true. And the reason why that's partially true is because dye was only available from the Phoenicians, who carefully protected how they made it from a specific kind of shellfish from a region of the Mediterranean that other kingdoms had not made it to yet. So the Phoenicians basically had a monopoly on purple dye, which means that they could charge a lot for it, which means the royals of various societies bought it and they wore that purple, and that meant usually that you were kind of wealthy. That's just how that worked out. Glass, right? All kinds of specialized glassware, pottery, and probably most important to a lot of the people, including the Hebrews, was cedar trees. The region of Mesopotamia never has grown, as far as we know, really big, thick forests. So if those people there wanted to have things built out of wood and not just mud, they had to actually bring in the cedar wood, and cedars, because it's resistant to a lot of kind of creatures. Cedar is resistant to mold, mildew, and bugs. And so a lot of times cedar was the most valued wood to bring in, and the Phoenicians were the ones to bring it to you. Even King David of Hebrew culture had to import cedar wood from the Phoenicians to build his temple. All right, what did the Phoenicians need? Because they had colonies all over the place. What did they need? Well, tin. The Phoenicians couldn't make anything, nor anybody else, out of bronze unless somebody had tin to mix with copper. And so from Britannia, yes, these guys went to where Britain is today and traded with the tribal peoples of ancient Britain to get tin. That's how far out they went when it comes to the west. And then we think the Phoenicians made it up to the Baltic, which is up where Sweden and Norway are, and Denmark as well. Hides and ivory and ostrich feathers and slaves, all items that the Phoenicians needed, and so they traded their stuff for this stuff, right? Gold, precious stones, and spices out of India. Who went to India to get the spices? You guys, the Phoenicians did that. All right, that's how far their trading empires went, all the way to India before anybody. We often get all excited when we talk about later history. Europe expanding in the 1400s after the Black Plague is finally done, and we have Portugal, and we have all these other guys, the English and the Spanish, expanding throughout the world like no one has ever done before. And to an extent, that's true, but when we get to the idea of trade with Asia and the West, and you've got all these guys connecting all this together by advanced maritime technology, yeah, the Phoenicians did a lot of that first. Okay, here's where things get interesting, especially if you're a linguist or you just want to know how things started. So the Canaanites, who were sitting right between the Phoenicians and the Egyptians, started to translate Egyptian hieroglyphics, into easily drawn symbols. Drawing pictures takes a lot of effort and requires advanced scribology. But Canaanites, they started to create these symbols. They don't quite equal sounds yet as far as we know, but they start to make symbols that equate with what the Egyptians were talking about in their days of power and empire. The Phoenicians are going to take what the Canaanites did and borrow, of course, from the Egyptians too, and they're going to create an alphabet. This is nothing like cuneiform. They're going to create an actual alphabet of 22 letters. And these letters, for the first time in human history, actually represent sounds, consonants and sounds. This had not been done yet. The Canaanites were not doing that yet. The Egyptians were not doing that yet. They were basically drawing pictures or with cuneiform, which is not represented here. Earlier cultures and other cultures at the same time were drawing images that have meaning, like how many bushels of wheat do you have. They didn't have a sound attributed to them. That's not how it was used. So the Phoenicians are actually attributing a sound to each of these symbols, which creates the world's first known alphabet. And that is sweet, man. That is so cool. It's so interesting. And then the Greeks are going to borrow from that because the Phoenicians traded with the early Greeks, and the Greeks kind of grow out of Phoenician culture to a certain extent. The Greeks will start to do the same thing. They actually create an alphabet that's based on Phoenician. You can see how close this is, all right? And then this is a huge leap here. What happens, I'm going to show you, well, how does this get to present-day English? It's real simple. Egyptian, not a sound, just an item. Phoenician, this actually means ox, but eventually it actually has a sound, aleph. We have the Greeks, alpha, again, a sound, a. Etruscans, which are in Italy, who basically borrowed from the Greeks, who had borrowed from the Phoenicians to create their letter for the sound a or ah. And then the Latins, who come out of the Etruscans, this means the Romans eventually, who have an empire and spread this modern version all over the Mediterranean. And then from that comes Spanish, French, right? Other forms of Latinized languages, and English will sort of borrow from all that stuff along with its own Celtic kind of linguist properties. So guys, if you want to talk about where we got the alphabet, we got it from the Phoenicians. All right, we modern people got that from Phoenician culture, and it was, you know, evolved all the way up. So how does this go? H is for fence, you know, a different language using H for fence, the sound of it. Here's the Canaanites, and here is 3 different versions right here of how the Phoenicians developed the picture for fence into a type of alphabet. Eventually, you've got this. You know, this is the most advanced version of Phoenician for what meant a fence, but also is the sound H. And then, of course, the Greeks take it, and the Latins take it, and then we got it, right? So, I don't know. This is fun stuff. And just to give you an idea of how many different cultures borrowed from the Phoenician alphabet, that also equated to putting sounds to letters, okay? The Phoenicians took this stuff, which did not have sounds for letters, and they borrowed it and created the alphabet, which eventually will have sounds for letters. And then, you know, because these guys had to write to all their different colonies all over the Mediterranean, so they needed to make it as easy as possible, and they did. And so Aramaic, Syriac, Hebrew, right, and other cultures that are now absorbed into other main cultures, Arabic and Persian, are branched out from ancient Phoenician. The Phoenicians also in other parts of the Mediterranean and Italy, the ancient Etruscans, which will evolve into the Latins, right, or into Rome, and that's the Western version of the Phoenician alphabet, which is what we have now. Archaic Greek, right, comes out of the Phoenician alphabet. Isn't this great? You know, ancient Hebrew and their alphabet comes out of the Phoenician alphabet as well, okay? It just keeps going. This is fun stuff, all right? So we all owe the Phoenicians a heck of a lot when it comes to culture. Here's the other things that we owe the Phoenicians. Paper out of papyrus. Strong shipbuilding technology, like having a hull of your ship with a strong, thick beam at the very bottom of which ribs come out of that planks are nailed onto. Other guys were not doing this yet. The Phoenicians built the strongest ships of the time, and that allowed them to go into the open ocean and do what they did. The North Star as a navigational tool. The Phoenicians are the first on record to do this. The use of a ship and technology aboard the ship, it's kind of simple really, to figure out how fast you're going. So basically taking math and creating time, distance, and speed equations. We owe that largely to what the Phoenicians had to develop. And of course, advanced maps and charts that allow you to relate how fast and how far you're going, so that you know where you are and and what you're doing, right? Similar to the ancient version of creating a GPS. All right, this is my favorite. This is a hypothesis, not a theory, guys, as far as I know. There is a hypothesis in the archaeological and historical communities, and that hypothesis is that the Phoenicians did not believe in sea monsters, because the Phoenicians traveled all over the place and seemed to not worry about that stuff. And almost nowhere in the writings of the Phoenicians do we hear about them saying, "Oh my gosh, I got hit by the sea monster." There's no Iliad and Odyssey stories coming out of the Phoenicians. Those stories where you have the sea monsters come from everybody that the Phoenicians traded with, and we're trying to figure out why everybody else has the same sea monsters and the Phoenicians don't have sea monsters. And our best guess, okay, again, this is a hypothesis, not a theory. A theory is basically fact. You know, it's a proven, you know, here it is. It's a theory of how we think it works based on observable and proven evidence, okay? Well, this is a hypothesis because we can't quite prove it, but we really suspect it. What we suspect is that the Greeks and the Hebrews and the Egyptians and the Canaanites and the Assyrians, the Hittites, we have a feeling that they all believed in the same kinds of sea monsters around the same time period, because the Phoenicians were trying to protect their trade empire and didn't want anybody else going to sea. So the Phoenicians could always be the guys at sea, right? And so we think they made up most of these sea monsters and told everybody they traded with in their trading empires about these sea monsters, so that everybody else would be too scared to go to sea, right? That's what we think happened. We don't know if it's true. Okay, again, we don't know. But everybody from the ancient Mycenaeans down to the Egyptians and even over to the Greeks under Alexander all had the same stories of the same sea monsters, okay? And so we have to wonder, well, where did you guys all get that story? Who told you about all that stuff? Maybe it was the Phoenicians. Again, hypothesis. It's just fun to hypothesize. Okay, so the Phoenicians are the first in this region to colonize over international waters, and the Phoenicians are mostly important. This is your final slide here. They're mostly important in connecting colonies over international waters, which connects all these different groups to each other. And you've got these different cultures of the Mediterranean being connected by the Phoenicians, and that means communication and development and cross-pollination of people and ideas. So the Phoenicians are basically the glue that holds together all these ancient societies that really creates what we now know as Western culture. And it's a pity that the Phoenicians no longer exist as their own people. It's, you know, their genes are still around, but they are gone. And I hate to say that, but that's just what happens, right? Okay. That is it for the Phoenicians. We're going to go ahead and move on to the Hebrews now. So let's go ahead and close this up.